Hello, I'm Janie Fugate, and this is the Rockbridge Reports on the Record. I'm here with Mark Rush, a politics professor at Washington and Lee University and a frequent political commentator on National Public Radio. Professor March, thanks so much for being here.
It's good to be here. Thanks, Janie.
So a few weeks ago, it looked like for certain that neither Republican Ken Cuccinelli nor Democrat Terry McAuliffe would have a substantial lead in the polls, but more recently it seems that Terry McAuliffe has been ahead, and then over the weekend again the polls tightened. So do you think that McAuliffe still has more reason to be confident than Cuccinelli at this point?
I think so. He's had a consistent lead for some time now. I mean, it's waxed and waned, sure, and I think as well you can expect that as you get closer to an election, I think there's a lot of push polling going on and a natural increase perhaps in interest as we actually get to election day. But for the most part, he's been running consistently 6, 7, 8 points ahead of Cuccinelli. And Sarvis has hovered around 8 points or so. So this is, I just think, a little bit of white noise, but McAuliffe is clearly in the lead. And unless something extraordinary happens in the next 24 hours, I think he will win.
And so how did McAuliffe manage to build the lead that he's had up until recently?
I think you can attribute it to a couple of factors. The first is that he's had a huge advantage in fundraising. He has lots more money. And second, there's no question that the divisions within the Republican Party, specifically the impact of the Tea Party on it, are beginning to take their toll, not only here in Virginia, but I think nationwide. So McAuliffe's had the advantage of a relatively united political party, and again, just a huge fundraising boost.
So working off something you just mentioned about the Tea Party, it seems that people are speculating that the Republicans are trying to distance themselves a little bit more from the Tea Party lately, and this hasn't been true in Cuccinelli's case, it seems. Do you think this has worked against him?
I think the Republicans generally in Virginia haven't suffered too much because of their affiliation with the Tea Party, essentially because the Republican Party of Virginia has been rather conservative relative to the National Republican Party. In New Jersey, say, you see a clear backlash against it. What's important to note, though, is that to say the Republicans are distancing themselves from the Tea Party, that's not quite accurate. I'm not being critical. You have to remember the Tea Party is part of the Republican Party.
Right.
And so what you essentially have here is a civil war. It may not be an evenly matched civil war, but you have essentially the mainstream Republicans and the so-called Tea Party Republicans really vying for the heart and soul of the Republican Party. And right now that's harming the party, whether that's because it's a civil war or because it's perceived as a real hard movement to the right. We still haven't sorted out yet. I think this election will give some indications of that, though. It's really an off-year election. Yet Virginia and New Jersey tend to be regarded as bellwethers for forthcoming presidential elections. So if you see a blue sweep of these states, then I think you will see some prognostications that perhaps the Tea Party is really doing damage to the Republicans and that this could result in some serious consequences in the next 2 years. And
so if Cuccinelli does manage to pull back ahead in the polls, what would the indications be for the civil war in the party?
I think it would be really hard to say. Again, this would only be in Virginia. Virginia's been running rather conservative for some time now, and I think pundits and critics would simply say, well, that's Virginia. More telling and more representative, I think, of the nation will be the New Jersey race, where Governor Christie seems to be pretty comfortably ahead and dominating Tea Party forces. And so if you draw any conclusions, it will be the extent to which New Jersey or Virginia is the better bellwether for the nation, and I think New Jersey is probably going to be regarded as the better one.
Okay, so I'd like to ask you about the third party candidate, Robert Sarvis. Polls over the past several weeks showed Libertarian Robert Sarvis with up to 10% support, but lately it seems like he's kind of fallen out of the limelight and after his brief surge that he had a few weeks ago. And this is a pattern for third party candidates as Election Day nears. Can you talk about why that is?
Well, the electoral system is stacked against them. Despite the really embarrassingly negative tenor of the race between the two major party candidates in Virginia, even here, under these circumstances, a third party candidate just doesn't stand a chance. Campaign finance laws are against them. The absence of a real political party organization that's statewide undermines his efforts. Even if he were to win, he really doesn't have a team or a ticket across the state with whom he can really join and present a united front. Third-party governors or third-party candidates generally tend to win a gubernatorial election or other sort of statewide election only if they're already famous. So that's why you had Jesse Ventura win in Minnesota years back. He trended very strong throughout that campaign and continued to increase in the polls right up into Election Day. And so he won, riding a surge of support. But still, that was really more, I think, a personal following than any testament to the strength of a third party in Minnesota. So as a rule, I think you'll find third parties tend to surge, and unless it's an extraordinary situation where you have a really good, strong candidate or leader running, they tend to wane towards Election Day simply because people realize that they don't have a chance to win, and they don't feel like they don't want to feel as if they're wasting their vote on a candidate who has no chance.
So do you think that Cuccinelli would have fared better if Sarvis hadn't been in the race?
From what I've read, the critics and the pollsters suggest that Sarvis has had more of an impact on Cuccinelli than he's had on McAuliffe. But generally, the last polls I saw still say that the margin might have been a little bit closer, but that McAuliffe basically retains a 6, 7, or 8 point lead with Sarvis in the race or without him.
Okay. And so in light of the federal government shutdown, party warfare on the national level, like you had mentioned, and the constant stream of negative ads in this campaign, what do you expect voter turnout to be like here and statewide?
I think generally you'll see a pretty low voter turnout. This will be due to the really terribly negative tenor that the campaign took on. It's really astonishing how embarrassingly negative, vitriolic, really uninformative the campaign ads have been. So they've told nobody anything about what's at stake in the governor's race. As well, and unfortunately, I think almost 45% of the state legislative seats are uncontested. So as a result, there's really very little incentive for voters to come out and vote unless they're really hardline partisans. And I think that the extent to which you see Sarvis consistently polling close to 10% in opinion polls, and that there's another 5% of voters out there who really haven't made their minds up. This indicates a real disillusionment with the two major parties, and when you compound that with really no reason to come out in half the state legislative districts, I think you're going to find an unfortunately very low turnout this time around.
And so you've said before that people are wondering if this election, the governor's race in Virginia, will track national trends with regard to the impact of the Tea Party and President Obama's healthcare rollout. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, pollsters and election pundits generally consider New Jersey and Virginia to be good races with which to track and perhaps see if there are any trends developing nationally. They represent, again, New Jersey tends to be more liberal, northern, urban. Virginia's more southern, more conservative. Both are next to two of our principal cities. Granted, New Jersey went red with Christie and so forth, but it's a different sort of Republican and a different sort of political culture between New Jersey and here. And so generally, if I think pollsters and students of politics will look to see if these two states tend to be trending the same way or in different ways. And again, if a reasonably liberal state like New Jersey and a reasonably conservative one like Virginia both trend away from the Tea Party, I think you will see generally a lot of analysis suggesting that the Tea Party could be either in trouble or really being spurned by the Republicans. What they end up doing, what this Tea Party movement ends up doing, remains to be seen. With regard to Obamacare, well, it's a little harder to say, I think. Folks are suggesting that some of the trend, at least towards the Tea Party, is a reaction to the frustrations with Obamacare. I think that may be true to a certain extent, but the Tea Party existed and was surging long before Obamacare was passed. So as a result, I think it's hard really to read much into those two in terms of their tracking together. Generally, you see, at least in Virginia, I think you're going to see really a real malaise this time around. Not much interest, and very, very hard really to sort out what Virginia means for the country, unless, of course, Cuccinelli wins. I think New Jersey's the better indicator. A big urban state, pretty diverse, facing problems generally that face the nation generally, with a Republican leader who really has kept the Tea Party at arm's length, whereas down here the Republicans have embraced them. So as a result, I think it's going to be really hard to see any particular way to piece together problems with Obamacare and the Tea Party, at least in the short term.
Okay. And historically, Virginians show something of a pattern where they vote for the opposite party in the governor's race. The opposite party is the president in the White House. And so if It's looking like if McAuliffe wins, that's not going to be the case this year. How much of that is connected, do you think, to the Republicans' role in the shutdown?
It could be connected to them, and I think perhaps it could be connected to them in other elections coming down the road too. On the other hand, Americans tend to have politically very short memories, and a year from now in the congressional elections, no one will remember who shut down what, I can assure you. In terms of trends that you see, whether or not Virginia tends to vote against the party in office in the White House or whatnot, I think pollsters will point to statistical trends and try to extract what they think are interesting patterns. But again, there's no particular rhyme or reason to that. I think you see a lot of instability in American politics over the last 20 years. You've seen surges and then, rises and falls in political patterns here and there, but nothing really consistent. In general, really since Reagan's presidency and Clinton's presidency, there's been a real dissolution of trends, I think, across the electorate. Voters are, I won't say they're confused, but their loyalties are being tested as they're facing challenges and issues that they never really expected to. So I don't know if we can read much into what Virginia does in terms of being the opposite of the White House or whatnot. I think what you're really going to see in this election is a diagnosis of what the health are of the two political party organizations, a diagnosis of what the local, that is the Virginia Tea Party, really is all about. And perhaps, exit polls will have something to do with Obamacare, but I think folks can separate that from the governor's race in Virginia, and they won't see this as really a referendum on that. This is a referendum on Virginia politics.
So do you think that American politics on a whole are more idiosyncratic than predictable?
I'm not sure what you mean by idiosyncratic. I mean, state by state, or what are you asking?
Yeah, you talked about this dilution of trends, and it's hard to really track down different political indicators because Americans have a short political memory, you said. So do you think that most of the polls aren't really indicative of long-term trends that could allude to something more? Okay,
a long-term trend may not be a recognizable trend. Okay, I'm not saying that American politics is random right now.
Right.
But for example, in my lifetime, folks actually could not comprehend the possibility of the Republicans controlling the House of Representatives. They do. The Democrats controlled the House for nearly 45 years, and then all of a sudden it broke with Newt Gingrich, and then it swung back, and now the Republicans are controlling it again. The Democrats control the Senate. We have Barack Obama, a man of African American heritage, in the White House. Our trends have really flipped in the last decade and a half, and as a result, it's really hard, I think, to predict where America is going right now. Incumbency is still at an astonishing high in terms of the Senate and the Congress and so forth. So there are certain patterns that remain intact. Once you're an incumbent, you're virtually unbeatable. But in terms of reading the tea leaves and saying, well, this is what Americans are thinking, I think we're still going through a sorting out period. That's not to say it's unpredictable or, I guess, idiosyncratic or random. But I still think if you read, you see general statements of frustration and confusion with the government. You see a lack of real partisan trends. You see criticism of the Republican Party from some of the more influential pundits in Washington and so forth. But these are all still rather isolated. I don't think there's any real trend to be read yet. And I think the best example of that right now would be, say, in both parties, there's no real clear indicator who will succeed, in the leadership positions and run, say, for president next time around, and why they would. The Republicans have been divided 3 or 4 ways over the last couple of presidential elections. And right now it's really hard to say who will be the successor, if you will, to Barack Obama. I think Hillary Clinton is not assuredly running. I don't know how well she is. Joe Biden certainly won't run, and if neither of them were to run, I think it's very difficult to really identify a clear front runner in either party who manifests, if you will, the ideological core or heart or spirit of the party. Both parties are kind of the Democrats are kind of wishy-washy. I don't think there's a clear ideological trend there, and the Republicans are terribly divided. And given that, whether that's a reflection of American politics or whether that's a cause of the divisions in American politics right now, I think it's really hard to say what direction politics is running in right now.
So finally, you mentioned voter disillusionment earlier. What needs to happen in American politics, like you're saying, for people to regain confidence in the government and for parties to be able to work together again?
Wow. How long do we have on the show? There's a lot of criticism of American politics. My own opinion is that we've reached such a critical point with regard to issues ranging from domestic issues dealing with education, healthcare, infrastructure, and whatnot, frustration with foreign policy issues, the cost of the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, and the crisis we were really facing in Syria. There's a lack of real consensus in the United States about how to get things done. And also, there's a lack of institutional capacity to do anything in an efficient manner. There's been a remarkable revisiting in the last months of whether or not, say, the government shutdown and so forth are good manifestations of how the constitutional system ought to work. I find it very disheartening when commentators or critics will say, well, this is just exactly what Mr. Madison would have expected, because the framers designed a constitution that divides powers and really renders a very inefficient way to get policy made. It's designed really to force compromise or move very slowly. But I don't think that's, while Madison may have expected the system to work in that way in general, he wouldn't have expected really the lack of cooperation and shared national interests, or shared sense of a national interest among our national legislators that we see today. And so, I really think what we have right now is a confrontation between the visions of two Virginians. Madison, built this constitutional architecture that really was useful and made sense 230 odd years ago. But Mr. Jefferson said a little revolution every now and then is a good thing. And I think, if anything, if I were to predict, I'd say that Mr. Jefferson is going to go through a renaissance right now, because the voters, the American people, are getting tired of what appears to be stalemate, appears to be really a lack of direction, and a lack of improving, visions of how life is here. And so as a result, voter disillusionment, I don't see it necessarily getting better or worse. Right now we're sort of in a malaise, and the question is, will the voters rise up and become involved in politics and perhaps try to change the party system? Or will leadership arise within those political parties and perhaps begin to move us in new directions? So I haven't really answered the question, because I admit I don't really have a clear answer. But I do think what you really do see is a critical situation coming really among or between different and competing visions of how the political system will work.
Okay, Professor Rush, we'd like to thank you so much for being with us. Again, for Rockbridge Report, this is Janie Fugate.